Hello everyone, my name is Alex Filipowicz, and today I'm going to share with you some of the work I've done on understanding how people use information from the past to form beliefs, and then importantly how these beliefs update when environments change. An important human skill is the ability to use information from the past to form beliefs. And these beliefs we use to make decisions for everyday things. For example, we might look at historical stock trends to figure out where best to invest our retirement savings, or look at different aspects of different schools to figure out where best to apply for grad school, or maybe different dietary trends to meet our health goals. But importantly, the beliefs we have are incomplete. We don't have access to all of the information in the world, and environments themselves also change. So another important human skill is the ability to update our beliefs when environments change. If we see that the stock market is starting to dip, is that something we can just ride out based on our past experience, or does it really reflect something that we need to change our investment strategies? If we notice that the school we've been eyeing hasn't made our favorite top 10 list, is that something we need to take into account when we're deciding where to apply? And then maybe more frustratingly, how do we reconcile the fact that wine, coffee, and chocolate both seem to cause all of our ailments as well as cure them? And so my interest is in understanding how people use information, the factors that drive our ability to update our beliefs. And so there's 3 studies I'm going to share with you today that look at different aspects of how people update their beliefs. The first is going to look at the notion of surprise or unexpectedness and how that drives belief updating in a more general sense, the general relationship between surprise and updating. The second is going to look at a little bit more nuanced level and look at individual differences in updating, and particularly how these individual differences are reflected in changes in the arousal system, which we can read out by looking at pupil diameter. And then third, I'm going to cover some of the neural mechanisms of updating, particularly through the lens of how updating processes are disrupted by different forms of brain damage. So to be able to update our beliefs, we first need to be able to detect that there's a mismatch between what we're expecting and what we're observing. And so a computation that's been proposed for this is the computation of surprise. So I think a great definition by Tegan and Karen is that the surprise of an event is mainly determined by the extent to which this event contrasts with some default or expected alternative. So what's important here is that something is only surprising insofar as it's unexpected or expected. So you can imagine that we have a belief where we expect a number of different potential events, but there's some events that we expect more than others. And so if we see an event that we're highly expecting, that should be something that's not very surprising. Whereas if we see an event that's less expected, that's something that should be more surprising. And so there's been a number of different frameworks that have been interested in understanding this relationship between surprise and belief updating. The first is in very simple cognitive environments, there seems to be this very robust relationship between surprise and updating, where people are updating in a sort of Bayesian-like way. When they see something that's unexpected, they update their beliefs, and they update their beliefs in proportion to how unexpected or how surprising that relationship is. So here it's sort of like a positive monotonic relationship between surprise and updating. Now, while these findings are generally really robust, they aren't consistent with more ecologically valid work. For example, work on heuristics, where you see things like the confirmation bias, where here people tend to look for information that confirms their beliefs while ignoring or discounting information that goes against their beliefs. And this has become particularly prevalent in recent research on things like fake news. So my interest was in trying to get a better sense of this relationship between surprise and updating. How do we reconcile that in simpler cognitive environments we see this positive monotonic relationship between surprise and updating, whereas in more ecologically valid environments we see this resistance to updating to surprising events. So to study this, I developed a task based on the game Plinko. Some of you might recognize this game from the game show The Price is Right, but the idea is that the host gives a person a sort of disc that they drop at the top of they drop in a table, and it bounces across a number of different pegs and lands in a slot that determines the prize the person gets. So I made a much less sexy version of this, where a person sees a red ball on a gray background, but they know that the ball is going to fall through these virtual pegs and land in one of these slots here. And what they're trying to report is using histograms to report how likely they believe the ball is going to fall in any of these particular slots on any particular trial. And importantly, the instruction is that they need to use these bars to represent where they think the ball is going to fall on future trials. And then as they see new ball drops, they can make changes to this histogram to reflect changes in their beliefs. So what's really nice about this task is that we get this nice, rich, dynamic representation of people's beliefs. And importantly, we get these without needing to make too many assumptions about what these distributions are meant to look like. People are telling us where they're expecting the ball to fall on any given trial. So we can use these histograms as a non-parametric measure of the expectations or beliefs that people have. So using this task, we looked at how likely people were to make changes to their beliefs as a function of how surprising different events were. So here we could look at what a person's histogram looked like on any given trial, and we can show them some balls that fall in slots that, let's say, confirm their beliefs. That would be of low surprise, where the ball falls in a slot where they have some high bar. And we can compare that to trials where balls fall in slots that fall farther away from where they expect, more highly surprising events. And so using these sorts of events, we looked at the relationship between how likely people are to make changes to their beliefs, how likely they are to make changes to their histograms, and then as a function of how far the ball fell away from their expectations. So the general way we quantified this was by looking at the proportion of times that people made changes to their histograms, that they made changes to their beliefs, as a function of how far the ball fell away from the mode of their histogram, the mode being the tallest bar that they had in their histogram. So if balls fall close to their tallest bar, that should be something that's of low surprise, whereas if it falls farther away from their tallest bar, that should be something of higher surprise. And we wanted to look at the relationship between this surprise on the x-axis and how likely people were to make changes to their beliefs. What we see is that there definitely is a tendency to have a positive monotonic relationship between surprise and updating, at least for a range of surprise values. When people see ball drops that fall close to where they're expecting them, they don't really make very many changes to their beliefs. And then as the ball falls farther and farther away from where they're expecting it, they increase their likelihood of making changes to their beliefs. However, they only do this up to a certain point. When balls get too surprising, when events get too surprising, people tend to resist updating, where they tend to sort of fall off and reject highly surprising events as sort of outliers. People explicitly said this when we asked them about their different updating strategies. What this suggests then is that surprise and updating aren't necessarily positively monotonically related, but rather surprise drives updating in a non-linear way. People will update their beliefs up to a certain point, but then tend to reject highly deviant events or highly surprising events as sort of outliers. What's important from this is that this sort of framework, understanding this relationship between surprise and updating, might help us predict when people will or won't update. Heuristics like confirmation biases might occur when evidence is too surprising. So that if a way to avoid things like confirmation biases might be reframing events so that they're closer to the beliefs that people already have. So now that we've looked at the general idea of the effect of surprise and updating, I'd like to transition to a next study where we looked at individual differences in updating, individual differences in how people react to surprise and other computations, and particularly through the lens of how these individual differences are reflected in individual differences in changes in arousal, which we can read out using pupil diameter. And so midway through, I'm also going to introduce the idea of complexity, which is a novel framework that I've developed that I've used to capture individual differences in the strategies people use to update. Now, there are a number of different reasons why measuring pupils is interesting for neuroscience and for psychology research. So first is that pupil diameter is a non-invasive proxy for levels of norepinephrine in the nervous system. Norepinephrine is released by a small brainstem nucleus called the locus coeruleus, which is involved in regulating sympathetic arousal, so that's fight or flight responses. And importantly, it's the sole source of norepinephrine to the cortex. So when it fires, it distributes norepinephrine diffusely throughout the cortex. The reason why pupils are interesting is that they're a proxy of locus coeruleus activity. When the locus coeruleus is highly active and releasing norepinephrine in the system, you get this very systematic increase in pupil diameter that you see both physically and that can be sustained when there are sustained levels of norepinephrine in the system. Given the locus coeruleus's role in sympathetic arousal, one thing that's very commonly measured with pupil diameters is responses to startle stimulus. One thing that pupils can definitely reflect is responses to is a sort of startle response. So this is a response to things that are very salient in the environment, whether it be a loud sound or a visual change. When something has changed in the environment, it generally has a degree of startle, and that startle is a reflection of an increase in sympathetic arousal that we can read out as increases in pupil diameter. More recently, pupils have been linked to more top-down, expectation-driven learning signals, and particularly belief updating. One of the first things is that pupils tend to be related to surprise. The more surprising events are, the more unexpected they are, the larger pupil diameter gets. And this tends to be related in a monotonic way, where the more surprising events are, the larger your pupils get. And then also, after you've been surprised, you've detected that something has changed, and more importantly, that you figured out that your belief isn't necessarily very robust, pupils tend to be larger during periods of uncertainty where you're not really confident in the belief that you have. And these changes in pupil diameter occur a little bit more slowly, where you get these longer sustained increases in pupil diameter while you're trying to figure out what the best belief is for your environment. Now, the problem with relating pupils to belief updating is that the environments, the task environments that are generally used to measure this relationship can have a tendency to confound bottom-up and top-down signals. Bottom-up startle responses are observed in situations where there's some kind of environmental switch, where there's some kind of change, an auditory change or a visual change in the environment that causes a sort of bottom-up startle response. And the top-down effects that have been ascribed to pupils are generally only tested in stable environments where the surprise is also, where surprise and uncertainty are related to environmental changes or environmental switches. So the challenge here is that these task environments confound bottom-up sensory startle signals with top-down expectation-based signals. So the goal of this study was to robustly link pupil dynamics with computations that are required for updating. So first, we really wanted to separate bottom-up stimulus-driven responses from more top-down cognitive influences on pupil. With the first hypothesis being that pupil dynamics that are related to belief updating should be driven more by context rather than the stimulus properties themselves. Now, the second one was that if these pupil dynamics really are reflecting beliefs and expectations, then these dynamics should also be driven by individual differences in these expectations. And so these individual differences we measured with a novel measure of complexity, which I'll introduce in the second half of this part. So the task we used to separate these bottom-up and these top-down signals was one in which people were hearing tones in either the left ear or the right ear, and were asked to predict which source was, were asked to use these tones to make predictions about which source was going to generate the next tones. So there were two sources that could generate tones. Source one would generate tones primarily in the left ear, sometimes in the right ear, whereas source two would generate tones primarily in the right ear, but sometimes in the left ear. So based on the history of tones that people heard, they had to predict which source was generating the current tones, and then importantly, predict which source was going to generate the next tone. So again, to really tease apart these differences between bottom-up and top-down signals, we had people do this task in two different environments. And so in these environments, the sources switched at different rates. So these switch rates are what we call the hazard rate. So a low hazard rate or a low switch rate is one where one source is generating tones for a number of different trials. So source 1, source 1, source 1, source 1, and then with a very low probability, the source changes to, let's say, a source 2, source 2, source 2, source 2, and then back to source 1, source 1. In this environment, stability is expected. It's expected that it's going to be one source that's going to generate tones for a number of trials, and then every once in a while it's going to switch to another source. So here, switches in the tones, the tone going from the left ear to the right ear, are what should be signals of surprise, should be more surprising events. Whereas when the tone repeats, which is what's expected, these should be less surprising, more expected. The second environment that we used was a high hazard rate environment, where here things switch frequently but predictably. So source 1 might generate the tone, then it'll be source 2, back to source 1, source 2, source 1, source 2, such that if you know which source generated the tone on the current trial, you can be pretty confident that the next source, the other source, is going to generate the tone on the next trial. So what this does is, now in this condition, now tone switches are what's expected. They're no longer the surprising event, whereas the repeats, the tone repetitions, if you hear the same tone twice, should be the surprising event since you're now expecting that things are changing. So what contrasting these two environments allows us to do is to really look at how pupils react to these different tone properties, whether the tone's switched or not, and look at how pupils react as a function of whether tone switches are expected or unexpected, whether they're surprising or not surprising. So first we looked at subject behavior to make sure that that people were doing the task the way we expected them to. On the y-axis here, I'm plotting the proportion of correct responses as a function of the trial since the source switched. So here you'd have, let's say, source 1, and then here on trial 0, it switches to source 2. In the low hazard rate environment, where sources aren't switching very often, we see that people are behaving in a way we would expect, where when the source switches, something that they're not expecting, people aren't predicting that the source is going to switch. And then as they get more evidence that the source is switched, they gradually change their predictions accordingly. In the high hazard rate condition, we see the opposite. We see that when the trial switches, people are expecting that a switch is going to occur. So they're correctly predicting that a source is going to switch when the source does. But then on the rare trials where the source repeats for a second trial, you see that they're not predicting that. Their behavior is well below chance. So what this says is that people's beliefs and expectations in this task are being modulated by these different contexts as to whether switches are expected or unexpected. So to derive measures of, to derive some of the computations that are required for updating and looking at how these are reflected in changes in pupil diameter, we fit people's behavior with a computational model, a Bayesian computational model that uses information from the task to predict which source is most likely. So it's a Bayesian model that looks at the history of past tones, as well as some internal estimate of the hazard rate to try to predict which of the two sources is most likely going to generate a tone on the next trial. And so we use this hazard rate as a free parameter to account for individual variability in how effectively people were learning or changing their behavior as a function of these different hazard rates. When we look at the model simulations, we can see that the simulations are recapitulating subject behavior pretty accurately. So the fits are doing a good job of capturing subject behavior in this task. And from this model, we can derive computations of surprise and uncertainty. So to measure surprise, we looked at when a tone occurs, we looked at on any given trial, what is the probability that the model predicted that tone is going to occur as a function of its belief. So if it's expecting a tone, this value should be low. If it's not expecting a tone, this value should be high. We took the negative log probability of this, which is a very common way of capturing surprise, of converting this into a surprise signal. To capture uncertainty, we looked at the model's belief strength. And so the belief strength was measured as, on every trial, how likely the model believed that source 2 is going to generate tones versus source 1. So if it's got a strong belief that source 2 is going to generate a tone, this should be a positive number. If it's a strong, so if you take the log of this, it should be a positive number. If it's a strong belief that source 1 is going to generate tone, it's going to be a very negative number. And so if the number is around 0, that means that the model is not very confident, not very certain. And so our measure of belief strength was taking the absolute value of this. So that values that are above 0 mean that there's high belief strength, either in source 1 or source 2. And then values of 0 mean that the person is, the model is very uncertain. And so we looked at whether these computations of surprise and belief strength were reflected in pupils in the two different contexts that we put people in. So first we looked at evoked changes in pupil diameter, changes from baseline as a function of how surprising the event was, the surprise being derived from individual fits to subject behavior. And what we see is that surprise causes these increases in pupil diameter as a function of surprise causes these increased changes in pupil diameter, so that pupil gets larger as events get more surprising. And I think what's really critical here is that this occurs in both of the different conditions. It occurs in the condition where switches are the surprising event, but also in the condition where repeats are the surprising event. So we see these reliable increases in pupil diameter as a function of the event that's surprising, not necessarily just whether the tone has switched or not. And then when we look at baseline pupil diameter, we see that the belief strength is reflected in baseline pupil diameter, the pupil diameter that's just before the tone occurs. When a person has high belief strength, you see smaller pupil diameter, but when they have low belief strength, you see larger pupil diameter. So what these results tell us is that there is a robust link between pupil dynamics and updating. We have a task that's really able to separate these bottom-up stimulus-driven responses from top-down cognitive influences on pupil dynamics, and we've robustly shown that these pupil dynamics are driven by the context in which they occur rather than the stimulus properties themselves. Now, the second hypothesis we had is that if there are differences in people's beliefs, these should, and if these signals are really driven by individual differences in expectations, then we should also see that if there are if people have different expectations in this task, then we should definitely see that pupil dynamics reflect these individual differences in the expectations that people derive. And so we measure these individual differences in beliefs as using a novel measure of complexity. So the idea of complexity is something that's been well studied in statistics and the machine learning literature, where people are trying to fit models to data and use those fits to make predictions about the future. Complex models are ones that fit lots of information from the past, whereas to make predictions, whereas less complex models are ones that fit smaller amounts of information. And so what we've recently shown is that this notion of complexity also applies to human belief building and belief updating. So if we take, for example, a belief about what the weather is going to be like tomorrow, a simple belief could be one that uses some kind of simple heuristic that looks at some limited aspect of the past. Let's say whatever the weather is going to be like, whatever the weather was yesterday is going to be the weather, or whatever the weather is like today is going to be the weather that I'm going to see tomorrow. And so in this case, if it's raining today, the person's going to predict that it's going to rain tomorrow. And this might be a reasonably accurate belief under certain circumstances, but if there are weather trends that are sweeping across the country or other factors that are important, it's going to miss out on some important information. It's going to underfit its environment. Conversely, a more complex belief might focus on a number of different factors, barometric pressure, temperature changes, weather trends across the globe, which might be great if these different factors are important for predicting the weather, but might overfit and might be less accurate if there are certain aspects that aren't important. For example, if it's paying attention to weather trends in the Middle East, it's likely not going to be very accurate for predicting what the weather is going to be like tomorrow in the US. So to measure complexity in the current task, we looked at the extent to which people's behavior reflected encoding of different task features. So the task features that we looked at were, so a simple belief in this task could be one that just looks at the tones, that just pays attention to the tones themselves. If I hear a tone in the left ear, I'm going to predict that source 1 is going to generate the tone on the next trial. But ignores any information that's potential information about the hazard rate. Conversely, a more complex belief could be trying to focus not only on the tones, but then also the different hazard rates. So is really paying attention to all of the information that's available from the task to make predictions. So to capture the complexity of different people's beliefs, we looked at the extent to which people's responses were dependent on different past tone and hazard features in this particular task. So we looked at, we created these features based on what the tone was and what the hazard rate was on any given trial. And then we measured the extent to which people's responses were modulated or depended on these different task features. We measured this using the notion of mutual information. So the complexity of a person's belief was the mutual information between these past features and people's responses, where the more people's responses depended on these past features, the more complex their beliefs are. We calculated complexity for each subject, and what you can see is a very distinct trend where people with more complex beliefs tend to have this larger separation between the different hazard rates. They're behaving more and more differently in the different hazard rate conditions, as they should, where they're expecting stability in the low hazard rate condition, but expecting instability in the high hazard rate condition. And this difference, it gets larger and larger as people are encoding more and more information about particularly the hazard rate in the environment. So now that we know that people vary as a function of their complexity, we wanted to see if there were different aspects of the task that varied. If there were different parts of the task where complexity had more of an influence and might vary more between subjects. And so we looked at how complexity, the relationship between complexity and this different fit hazard rate that we derived from the Bayesian model I introduced earlier, and looked at how far people's beliefs were from the optimal true hazard rate as a function of the complexity of their beliefs. What we see in both hazard rate conditions is that people with more complex beliefs do tend to have fit hazard rates that are better reflective of the actual hazard rate in the environment. However, another thing we noticed was that the variability in the low hazard rate condition was much smaller than in the high hazard rate condition. Now, regardless of people's complexity, people were pretty consistent in the low hazard rate condition. They were able to expect that stability was the best thing and were surprised and updated when switches occurred. So the variability in people's strategies in the low hazard rate condition was much different than in the high hazard rate condition. In the high hazard rate condition, complexity had a much stronger effect, where people with more complex beliefs were more likely to be the ones that had better expectations about the fact that switches should be predictable. Whereas people with less complex beliefs had much more difficulty. And importantly, there was a much wider range of variability in people's expectation in this high hazard rate condition. So what we expected is that if pupils are really reflecting something about the individual differences in the beliefs that people have, then these individual differences would be more strongly reflected in the high hazard rate condition than in the low hazard rate condition. So what we looked at was how large people's pupils were after a tone had switched minus after a tone had repeated. And we looked at that in both the evoked changes and then also in the baseline pupil diameter. So here, if you see dots that are above this 0 line, that means that pupils were larger when a switch occurred, whereas if the dots are below this 0 line, it means that pupils were larger when repeats occurred. What we see with the evoked change is that in the low hazard rate condition, everybody's pupils tend to be above 0, so their pupils are larger after a switch occurs when the thing that occurs less frequently occurs. However, there's no real relationship with complexity. So the strength of this relationship doesn't really matter. It doesn't really reflect complexity. Everybody is sort of has people dynamics that reflect sort of similar behavior. However, in the high hazard rate condition, we do see this relationship between complexity and pupil dynamics, such that people with more complex beliefs have pupil dynamics that better reflect the fact that repeats are the more surprising event in this high hazard rate condition than people with less complex models that haven't really built a proper expectation in this particular environment. And we also see the same trend in baseline pupil diameter, only in the high hazard rate condition. So the take home from this whole part is that pupil diameter does reflect the computations that are required for updating. Evoked changes reflect the computations of surprise, whereas baseline changes in pupil diameter reflect the confidence or uncertainty of pupil diameter, of a particular belief. And importantly, these effects are context dependent and not just dependent on the stimulus properties, whether there were switches or whether there were repeats in the environment, but whether these switches or repeats are expected. And then last is that these dynamics depend on the idiosyncratic complexity of subject beliefs. In environments where these idiosyncrasies are larger, in our case in the high hazard rate condition, we see that these dynamics of evoked change in baseline pupil diameter depend on the idiosyncratic beliefs that people have in that particular environment. So now that we've looked at individual differences in updating and how these individual differences are reflected in changes in the arousal system, I'd like to shift to a final study where we examined the neural mechanisms of updating, how different brain processes govern some of these computations that are required for updating. There are a number of different brain networks that are involved in driving belief updating. One main one is the salience network. That's very commonly found in studies that examine belief updating. So the salience network is a network that's comprised of the anterior insula and the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. So the anterior insula would be this area here, these areas here, then the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex is this area here. And importantly, both of these areas are active during when people are surprised, when you experience something that's unexpected, and then also during periods of uncertainty where you have very low confidence in your beliefs and you're exploring alternative beliefs that might better explain the evidence you're observing in your environment. One challenge is that it's difficult to tease apart what the role of these two areas are because they're often coactive. They're active together during periods of surprise and uncertainty, and modalities like fMRI make it difficult to understand the time course or specifically to separate the distinct roles between these two regions. So a study that I performed was one where I looked at how damage to particularly the anterior insula influences belief updating. And this is particularly interesting because we found that people with strokes to the middle cerebral artery strokes tend to have poor updating performance. And what's critical here is that MCA strokes or middle cerebral artery strokes often affect the anterior insula, but they spare the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. So that's the middle cerebral artery is sort of on the outside of the brain and goes very close or sometimes on top of the anterior insula. But it often spares the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, which is much farther inline. So the middle cerebral artery would be around here, whereas the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex would be here and a little bit farther up. So people with middle cerebral artery strokes offer or looking at performance in people with middle cerebral artery strokes offers a window into what the role of the insula might be while sparing the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. So in these patients, what we've often observed is that that learning itself is still preserved. So people are able to detect changes in their environment. So they're able to learn something, and then they're also able to detect that what they're learning isn't necessarily appropriate when something actually changes, whether it be a strategy in a particular game or even in perceptual tasks when there are perceptual aspects of an image or of sounds that occur these patients are able to detect that there's something that has changed and that what they've learned is no longer valid. But what really seems to be the problem is a problem of exploration, is a problem of exploring the alternative beliefs, an alternative belief to rectify the difference between what they're observing and what they were expecting. So finding a new belief to match what they're observing in the environment. So this seems plausible because particularly the anterior insula is very strongly active during these periods of uncertainty. So while people are exploring these alternative beliefs, the anterior insula seems to have an important role in doing that. And in particular, it seems to be related to being able to learn from errors or to learn from negative feedback. So I wanted to test this a little bit further to see if some of these impairments in exploration after brain damage could be due to damage to the anterior insula. So to really see if the anterior insula could have this role in these exploratory processes that are required for updating. So I designed a task, or I used a task that's designed to capture these exploratory strategies and computational modeling to capture updating strategies in patients with updating impairments. And so one of the hypotheses I wanted to test was that there might be this asymmetry in processing positive versus negative feedback during these exploratory periods. And then second, I wanted to link these deficits with specific lesions. And in particular, the hypothesis was that people with anterior insular damage to the anterior insula would have stronger impairments in updating performance. And so this link is going to be performed using voxel-based lesion symptom mapping, which I'll explain a little bit later. The patients that we tested, we had 17 patients overall. All of them had middle cerebral artery strokes. There were 9 that had damage to the left hemisphere and 8 to the right hemisphere. Now we didn't see any differences in this particular sample. We didn't see any hemispheric differences in updating performance. We just collapsed the hemisphere with the most brain damage onto one single hemisphere. So what you're seeing here is either left or right brain damage. The hemisphere that was most affected collapsed onto one side. And this is sort of the overlay of the areas that were damaged in at least 3 patients. And we had 13 patients that presented with anterior insular damage. To test their different updating strategies, particularly exploratory strategies, we had participants perform the following tasks. So people would see a set of stimuli, either a 1, a 3, or a 5, which would appear on a screen. And they had to figure out which of 4 buttons corresponded to each of these different stimuli. So, for example, in this case, there was a particular rule that they had to learn. So this particular rule, the first button would, if you see a 5, you should press button 1. If you see a 1, you should press button 2. If you see a 3, you should press button 3. And then in this case, the 4th button wouldn't be used. Then as the participants learn, the rules change at unannounced points throughout the task. So that now the 1 would be associated with the first button, the 5 with the second button, the 3rd with the 4th button, and now the 3rd button is the one that's not used. And these rules would continue changing. So in total, the rules would change every 33 to 48 trials, and there were 48 switches in total over the period of 2 days. So just to give you a sense of what the task looked like, if let's say this is the current rule that the person's trying to learn, the person would see a digit that would appear on the screen, they would make a button press, and if they made the correct button press, then the number would appear green on the screen. If they pressed the incorrect button, then they would see a red X, which would indicate an incorrect trial. Now, what we also, to really test how effectively people can use feedback in this environment, we also included 10% incongruent feedback trials. So we called these trap trials. We told people that the computer would sometimes lie to them. So that on 10% of the trials, if they made the correct response, they would get a red X, and if they made the incorrect response, then the number would turn green on the screen. And so what we specifically told patients and participants in this task was that if they see something that's unexpected, it's up to them to figure out whether it corresponds to a real rule change or if it just corresponds to the computer lying to them. So this is what the performance looked like. We had a group of younger adults that were undergrads, older adults that were closer in age to the patients that we tested, and then the patients themselves. And so what I'm plotting is the proportion correct responses as a function of the trial since the last rule switch. So what you can see is that patients overall did tend to do worse than either of the healthy control groups. But the challenge, when we looked a little bit more closely at our patient data, we saw that the patient performance was very bimodal. So there was basically one half of patients that performed at or above the level of healthy controls, whereas the other half performed well worse. And you can see that it's not an even spread, it's that it's a very clear bimodal split where you have one group here that is performing above the lower 95% confidence interval of older adults. So this group we called good updaters, and then another group that's performing well below this mark. We called them poor updaters. And if we plot their behavior, we can see that there's this very clear split in behavior. Now, one thing that I'd like to highlight is that the poor updaters still are learning. They are able to learn the rules above chance and consistently above chance. It's just, and they're able to detect that things change. It's just that the level at which they end up is much lower than the control groups or the good updaters. So we next use computational modeling to try to figure out, to try to find a model that's able to account for the differences between these two patient groups. So we used reinforcement learning models to try to capture these differences. So the first was just a very simple Q-learner, a reinforcement learning model that is trying to figure out what the best action is for any of these given stimuli. So as it sees stimuli and as it performs actions and it gets feedback, it reinforces which of these actions is most likely going to be rewarded which action is going to be most likely going to be rewarded for each of the different stimuli that are observed. So this model can detect the changes that have occurred, can update, can learn, and can update, but it does so much more slowly, where it first needs to unlearn a rule that it has before it's able to learn a new one. And it's also very susceptible to negative feedback. It'll learn from from trap trials. It's susceptible to trap trials, where it'll learn from trap trials rather than trying to ignore them. The second model that we considered was one that's been well validated for this particular task and represents the strategies that healthy controls use in this particular task. So here, in addition to learning what the best action is for each of the different stimuli, this model also considers what the best rule is for any particular part in the task. So when it gets feedback, it looks at that feedback with respect to the rule that it's currently using. If it gets negative feedback, then it'll lower its confidence in its current rule. Whereas if it gets positive feedback, it'll increase its confidence in its current rule. And importantly, it won't get caught out by different trap trials. If it sees negative feedback, it will lower the confidence it has in its rule, but it'll wait a little bit before it switches to a new rule. Once it lowers its confidence in its rule, it'll start searching a space of alternate counterfactual rules that might better be suited, and it'll switch between these different rules as it learns. So this is a much more efficient, and it might be a little bit more computationally complex, but it updates much more effectively in this particular task environment than a simple Q-learner. So when we fit these models to subject behavior, we see that the probe model, that is this counterfactual model that best fits healthy controls, it does a really good job of capturing good updaters' performance. However, it has much more difficulty capturing the poor updaters' performance. When we look at the simple Q-learner, we see that the Q-learner isn't able to adapt as effectively as the good updaters are or the probe model. But it's able to capture this low level, this low learning, the lower asymptote of learning for the poor updaters. Now, the one thing that we noticed, however, was that in order to capture this low endpoint for learning, it needed to have a very low learning rate. And the difference there is that the speed at which the Q-learner model updates is much slower than the poor updaters. The poor updaters are able to detect that things have changed and increase their proportion correct responses reasonably quickly, but just end up at a lower asymptote. And so to try to capture these differences, I looked at some of their behavior. And one of the things that we noticed was that patients with some of these poor updating patients had a tendency to sort of abandon their rules whenever they got negative feedback. So I captured this using a WinQL lose reset model, where it's a model that's very similar to the Q-learner, where it learns the same way from positive feedback as the Q-learner. But then when it gets negative feedback, it resets its action rules for the stimulus that was just observed. So it's, in effect, it's abandoning its rule set. It's forgetting its rule set and starting sort of fresh. So the effect that this has is that this model is able to learn to abandon its previous beliefs much more quickly. But because it gets caught up by trap trials and negative feedback, it has this very low asymptote in learning. And you can see that the behavior from this model captures the patient behavior much more cleanly than the Q-learning model. So this really shows that there is this whereas the good updaters, who again still have lesions in their brain, are able to use these more complex counterfactual rules from the probe model, the poor updaters have much more difficulty with that, and instead seem to be caught out by these by negative feedback trials and trap trials by forgetting some of the rules that they had already learned. So the last thing we wanted to do is to see if any of these differences were reflected in any particular lesions that the patients had. One thing we found was that while most of our subjects had lesions to the insula, poor updaters were much more likely to have lesions to the anterior portion of the insula rather than the posterior portion, whereas the good updaters, again, had some insular lesions, but more in the posterior parts or smaller areas of the anterior insula. So to test whether the insula was really involved to see if really the insula was the best way of splitting these two groups of patients, we used voxel-based lesion symptom mapping to look at, which looks at how much each different voxel of damage in different patients' brain relates to some kind of measure of performance. And so what this measure found was that an area of the anterior insula was highly related to incorrect responses. The split that we saw in incorrect responses between the poor and the good updaters was highly predicted by damage to the anterior insula. There were a few other metrics that also correlated with the same region, but it's really a robust way of showing that these differences that we are observing in different patients, although all patients did have strokes and all patients did have brain damage, it seemed to be the ones that had damage to the anterior insula that were the most affected in this particular task. So what we can take from this is that anterior insular damage really impairs these exploratory processes that are required for updating. We do see that there's a preserved learning from reward, but it's an inefficient use of the errors of learning from feedback or learning from errors, which seems to prevent the formation of these complex hierarchical beliefs in this particular task that weren't impaired in the good updaters. And I think what's also important is that this really highlights the necessity for the necessary role of the insula in belief updating. Something that's very difficult to establish using imaging because it's often coactive with the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. So what this shows is not necessarily that it's sufficient for updating, but definitely that it's necessary, that just having the DMPFC alone doesn't guarantee you that you're going to be able to update. And so just to conclude, I started by giving you a sense of what the relationship was between the computation of surprise and unexpectedness and how that drives general influences in belief updating. I then moved into a study that shows that there are individual differences in updating and that these computations of surprise and how they're reflected in arousal systems does depend on individual differences, particularly as they're measured by our measure of complexity. And then last is that damage to the anterior insula that the insula is a really important brain region for belief updating. And in particular, when the anterior insula is damaged, it disrupts the ability to learn from negative feedback in a way that's required for effective, healthy belief updating. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, all of my mentors, and I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk.